I think most of you are aware that the City Council approved the final docket of work items, code amendments and comp plan amendments in December. They added a few additional items from the ones that were recommended by the Planning Commission. I'll go over that in a moment. The City Council also approved the biennial budget in December, and that included a couple of things that will relate to our work. One being they funded a staff position, now I'm blanking on the title, senior policy analyst position, and that's to start July 1st of this year. So in the next few months, we'll begin the hiring process for that position, and they will be directly supporting commission work on code amendments and other policy and long-range planning work. I will be supervising the planning team going forward. So both our current planning, our permit reviews, as well as our regional and long-range and legislative work. You'll be seeing a lot of me in the next 6 months until we're able to hire this new position, and then we'll be probably sharing this role with the Planning Commission. I guess that's all in addition to some other duties that I'm doing, some other folks I supervise and other things with my deputy director hat. So just wanted to make it clear that the next 6 months we are kind of short-staffed, but it will be getting a bit better come July. In addition to that, the budget also included consulting resources to update and expand our impact fees. So we'll be adding a fire impact fee and then updating the parks and transportation fees. We need to have a consultant do a study for the basis of those fees. We'll also be beginning a housing needs assessment. And this will be something that'll inform the comprehensive plan update that we were just talking about that's due in 2024. So a piece of the comprehensive plan is the housing element. And we are supposed to do this housing needs assessment to look at, what is the existing housing that we have in Mercer Island and what are the current and future needs for housing. So looking at the demographics we have and what we're projecting in the future, and then the different housing segments and types that would be needed to house the people in those different demographic groups. So for example, we would look at, do we have enough affordable units at different levels? And then do we have enough senior housing? Do we have enough housing for families? And just looking at the different sizes and costs and types of housing that are available and that might be needed in the future. And that'll help us inform that update to the housing element that we'll need to do as part of the comp plan update. So that work will begin either at the very end of this year or the beginning of 2022, depending on just kind of timing of how our work goes towards the end of this year. So I wanted to make you aware of those things that came through in the budget. And then the other thing to mention is that the growth target conversation is happening right now. So one of the things required under GMA is that in advance of these major comprehensive plan updates that are occurring every 9 years now, we have to coordinate with the region to allocate future growth to each jurisdiction so that we can plan to accommodate that growth. So PSR, Puget Sound Regional Council, updated their vision for the 4-county region. They call it Vision 2050, and that included kind of the regional policies for growth and the regional growth strategy, it's called. It's the plan for how growth should happen across the 4 counties. And then right now, King County is updating their county-wide planning policies. So these are the planning policies for all of King County and all of the jurisdictions in King County. And a piece of that is setting the growth targets for each city. So a growth target is a goal that we plan towards. There's one for housing and one for employment. So we need to plan for a certain number of housing units and a certain number of jobs to come to our city in this horizon of 2024 to 2044. So right now there's a discussion happening within our regional geography. So Vision 2050 groups jurisdictions into different geographies like core cities, urban centers, high capacity transit communities. That's what Mercer Island is categorized as now because we are adjacent, or we have a high capacity transit station that includes light rail and bus rapid transit. And there's also smaller cities and rural areas. So within the high capacity transit group, there's 10 or 12 jurisdictions, and there's a certain amount of growth that's allocated to this segment that has to be divvied up to each jurisdiction. So you can kind of think of it as a big pie. There's around, like if you're talking about the housing units, it's around 29,000 housing units are expected between 2024 and 2044 that need to be divvied up between these jurisdictions. And so right now there's a caucus process going on that Jeff Thomas and I are staffing for our city. And we're all negotiating about how big a piece of pie can each city accommodate. And so if you've been paying attention to city council meetings, we've been in front of the city council now at the last 2 meetings to discuss this process and get their input on where they would like, how they would like us to negotiate within this caucus process. And last night they indicated that there was pretty much unanimous support for us to be at the low end of the range that King County has provided in terms of, they've given a broad range for each city in terms of what a growth target for that city might look like, depending on a variety of different factors. We're going to continue discussing this with the city council in February, and then the negotiations will proceed through the spring. It will be finalized in June. So I wanted to let you guys know about that process because it will have a big impact on the comprehensive planning work that we start next year and that this commission will be involved in. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump into a little bit more about our work plan for this year. Did somebody have a question? I didn't quite understand what that was. It might have just been a funny noise. Okay. So.
Oh no, I was just saying, I think it was a chair moving. Go ahead.
Okay. For this year, we've got several items on the work plan. There were 9 items docketed, and we also have a few other things that are kind of out there that need to be taken care of. So for the docketed items, we discussed all of these at our last meeting, and these are the ones that the council ended up putting onto the final docket. So there's a comprehensive plan land use map amendment. This one is related to the South End Shopping Center, and there was an error a couple years ago that resulted in it being misdesignated. There's 2 amendments that Matthew Goldbach recommended, and one of them relates to the comprehensive plan amendment implementation process, and the other relates to conditional use permit applicability. Then we have the wireless code. We had a placeholder for anything relating to the town center retail work that the council will be discussing later this spring. There's a question mark there because this one's a placeholder, so it may or may not result in council directing the planning commission to take up an amendment. We have the sign code, and then impact fees. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a consultant helping to update the basis for the fees. And we're also looking at creating a new fire impact fee. We need to do a little more analysis in terms of whether that will require a comp plan or code amendment that would need to come before this commission. I believe that the fire impact fees will need to come before this commission, but the updating of the other fees may not. So just a heads up on that. And then we have the recommendations that came from Ms. Boatsman and Mr. Thompson related to the nuisance code and the administrative code. So we have a large docket. We also have, I call this the Richard Hill Code Amendment. This one relates to the JCC and the French American School. It was a code amendment proposed prior to the requirement that code amendments be docketed coming into play. So this one was proposed about a year ago, last February, and the council did an initial discussion of it. Well, it was really delayed because of COVID. So their initial discussion didn't happen until August. And at that time, they decided to wait to determine whether we should do further analysis of this code amendment. And they're due to look at that again next month in February. So we'll be hearing more in terms of whether the council decides if we should further discuss this amendment or not. So if the council elects to review the amendment, then it would come to the Planning Commission. And we will need to look at this amendment and make a recommendation related to what should happen with it, whether approved or modified or denied. And then we've got our annual comp plan amendment. So with the map amendment we'll be discussing tonight, and if any other amendments happen to come through related to town center or the impact fees, those will all be packaged together into one comp plan amendment that we'll consider in the fall. And then we'll have our annual docketing process again. And finally, at the very end of the year, we're hoping to get started on our work related to the residential development standards. We are due to look back at the update that was done in 2017 and do an analysis of, how it worked. Was it successful in achieving the objectives that were identified at the beginning of the process? So staff will be doing some work later this year, both a technical analysis in terms of the houses that have been built under the new code, as well as some outreach to the community and to builders and developers to get feedback on how they think this new code is working. And we're hoping to bring back the results of that analysis to the commission at the very end of the year. And then that will go to council in the beginning of next year, and they will be making a decision on if any additional code amendments related to the residential development standards are needed. So that's a lot. We have a big, we have a lot on our plate this year. And as I mentioned in the beginning, our staff is less this year than what we've had in the past, and especially in the next 6 months. So we're looking at just meeting once a month for this year. I've got the dates there if you want to jot them down, but it's the third Wednesday of the month. So just wanted to get the dates out there. As usual, we won't meet in August, but we are planning to meet every month. Other than that, I noted in my email a week or so ago that February 17th, our next meeting is during the midwinter break for Mercer Island School District. I did want to check in. I didn't hear anything from email, but if anyone has a concern about meeting at that time, or if we think we might need to reschedule, it would be great to hear from you guys. Does that meeting date work for everyone?
I'm not going anywhere.
I figured it would be less of an issue this year than most, since people aren't really traveling, or if you are, you still may be able to join by Zoom. So
Frankly, nobody should be going anywhere. But you have places to go that don't involve contact. Then
yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people are doing cabins and Airbnbs and stuff. So okay, sounds like we're
sharing. Let's see here. Okay,
Sorry, Commissioner Boatsman, did you have a question?
yeah. Are you going to be sharing this document that we've been looking at with us afterwards so we can refer to it in future?
I'd be happy to email it out to you. That's no problem.
Please, thank you very much.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, Allison and Jenny and I, and a lot of this has been sort of changing in real time, which is why we didn't get it prior to the meeting. So
Yeah, I have a whole schedule for the year, but I know that things are still in flux, and dates of when we will get to various topics is going to shift around, I'm assuming, quite a bit. So I just wanted to talk about what's happening for the next 3 meetings tonight. I'll go over that in a second. But I have been thinking throughout the year and how we fit in all of these topics. So I've got kind of a mental plan for that, and I'll be keeping you guys updated, probably in sort of 3-month rolling cycle of what's coming up. So one thing before I get to that, and I mentioned this in my email, because we're going to a more compressed schedule, we are going to have a more focused process for reviewing items with the commission. And we're looking to have a 2 or 3 meeting process for each item that we review. So for more simple items, they'll come to you for an initial work session. And that's when we would really like to get the majority of the feedback from the commission in terms of, your initial review and read, any questions, any concerns, all of your ideas and recommendations or things that you would like us to further analyze or draft text around. Let's try to get everything out as soon as we can. Definitely don't hold back if you have any concerns or ideas. Let's try to get as much as we can out in the initial work session, because then the item will come back for a public hearing and recommendation at the next time you consider it, either at the next meeting or 2 meetings ahead. And so we need to really get the majority of the commission's feedback in that first session so that we can have a good draft to go to the public hearing, and then only make minor adjustments prior to doing the recommendation. For more complex topics, we do have an option of adding a 3rd meeting, because I understand that, you know, we might need a couple rounds of edits and revisions, particularly after we hear from the public during the public hearing. We may need to make some additional revisions and come back for the final recommendation at another meeting. So that's the process that we're looking to for this year. I wanted to stop here and just see if anybody has questions about that.
Anybody have a question? I see a lot of shaking heads, so I think we're good.
All right. Okay, so this is what the next 3 meetings, the next 3 months looks like. Tonight, we've got a few items to review. These were 3 that we lumped together because they are a little bit more simple and straightforward. So those we'll get our first work session in tonight, and then they'll come back next month in February for the public hearing and recommendation. We'll also do a work session in February on the wireless code. So this is one of the items that the commission began reviewing last year, and it was put on pause in March when COVID hit. So we'll be picking this back up. We're likely going to be shrinking the scope a little bit to focus on adopting permanent regulations that kind of align our code with the federal regulations and update a lot of our definitions and code language so that we can implement these kind of permitting processes more smoothly. We're not likely to delve into as much of the design issues that we were considering last year, mainly because of staffing, and we need to just have a streamlined review and get a permanent code adopted before the existing interim regulations expire in June. So we're kind of looking at this as a phase 1 for wireless code, and perhaps we can delve into the design and aesthetics in a future phase, in a future year. Commissioner Boatsman, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I feel nervous about the idea that we, you know, are discouraged at this point, or maybe it's not feasible to deal with some of the design or environmental impacts of these types of facilities. I really feel like if whatever is adopted soon and things get installed, it would be too late to try to think we would come back to it, I would imagine. So I'm just a little uncomfortable with that, because I feel that there's some things that I would certainly want to bring forward in a discussion there, and we could consider.
Yeah, we're speaking with the city manager and city attorney. We will be likely bringing in outside legal counsel to help us with drafting this amendment. And so depending on who we're able to bring in, the consultant or the attorney for that, you know, if they have some code language that they've helped other cities adopt that relates to these more of the design and aesthetics and sound and those kind of things, we may be able to pull some of that in a quick and easier way rather than crafting something from scratch ourselves. And so if it makes sense to do that, I think that might be possible, but I do not think we'll have capacity or time to have a long process of, you know, creating a whole new code section from scratch.
Certainly not a long process, but you know, some, as you point out, there could be some very efficient ways of dealing with these types of issues and
So if I might suggest, Carolyn, because I don't disagree with you, I think I have 2 points here. One, we should be as streamlined as possible. So, you know, if you have things that you do want to bring to the table that aren't going to take us too far off of where we want to go, that interject some of what you're talking about, I think it's really about making sure that we just have just come as prepared as possible, which I know you are always good at doing. Number two, I sat through the meeting where the council was reviewing the docket and all of these items. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing based on what I heard and what I witnessed. And Allison can correct me if I mischaracterize any of this, but, you know, they added a number of things to the work plan with the knowledge that it was going to cause some of the other things that we were doing to be, I don't want to say not, it was just going to impact the scope of what we could do with the other things. And that's the direction that we got from the council. And in effect, we are operating under their guidance of what they want us to prioritize. And so I agree with your assessment, but the decision was sort of made for us by the council and how they want us to spend our time. So I would say we should all be as prepared as we can for all of these things when they do come to the table, so that if there are pieces that we want to dig into, we just need to be as efficient as possible in approaching them.
Mm-hmm.
I see that the council is, you know, pressing for efficiency and has us wanting to do a lot of things in a short time. But in terms, again, of efficiency, I would suggest that rather than any one of us needing to go and, you know, research these matters and bring them forward, that we refer back to what we came up with over a year ago. We did outline the areas in which we had some concerns, and we actually took some votes on preferences, and you know, any outstanding questions were sort of left hanging. So what I would suggest is pick up on those questions we raised at that time, and those would be the things to bring to that first meeting, I would think, so that we would be able to start afresh with some answers.
Yep. And I also am trying to reinstitute regular leadership meetings between the chair and vice chair of the planning commission and the mayor and deputy mayor, as well as the planning department and the city manager or assistant city manager. And so hopefully we can bring this concern back to them and saying like, hey, we feel like certain things maybe have been underscoped as far as what they need or should be, and just get further guidance from them on how they want us to proceed.
Okay, but I just don't want to personally be, you know, because I brought this up, for their expectation for me to go back and come up with all of those things that our commission already outlined. So I'd rather have that brought forward by the staff.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to take a look back at the work from last year. And I think as we bring our consultant attorney on board, I'm happy to talk with them about, you know, what were the things that we were looking at last year in terms of, you know, would it be possible to add these to the scope without it being a bunch more work? And, you know, we can see if there's a way to thread the needle. And, you know, I'm hoping that the consultant we hire will have done similar code amendments in a few other cities in this area and may already have some good language to suggest. And in that case, it could be pretty simple, but I don't know if that'll be the case or not. That's my hope.
Yes, I certainly hope so.
Great. Well, I've made a note to bring it up with the leadership of the council, and we'll get some clarity
Thank you.
as well. Go ahead, Allison. Sorry.
Okay, so I guess the final thing here on this slide was just that then the wireless code might come back as soon as March 17th for a public hearing. I think depending on how things go with our work session, we can decide if we need 2 meetings or 3 meetings for that and schedule accordingly. If that doesn't go forward on March 17th, we can move up another item, such as the sign code, and start working on that. Okay, so tonight we've got 3 items to review. We don't need to make a decision tonight. This is just our work session. So I'm just looking for your thoughts and feedback on each of these items, and they'll come back for a public hearing and recommendation in February. So first, we're going to jump into the map amendment. So this is the one that there was just a staff error in 2018 that misidentified the South End Shopping Center on this land use map as commercial office. And the amendment tonight will redesignate it as neighborhood business, which is what it should have been all along. We're not changing the designation or the zoning, we're just correcting this error on the map. So I don't know how well you can see this, but this is the new proposed map, and you'll see that it has neighborhood business here in the legend, and there's sort of a dark gold color there, and the commercial office is more of a bright yellow up here. This is the existing map with the error. It does not contain neighborhood business, and it designates the South End Shopping Center as commercial office. So this is just literally replacing the map. It does not edit any of the text of the code. Does anyone have questions about that?
Jenny?
I think we've discussed this a number of times, and it was very clearly simply a Scrivener's error. I don't know that we actually need to have any particular discussion on this. Would it be out of order for me to move to adopt the proposed map as shown?
We
So-
actually have to hold a public hearing as part of the process, so we'll need to wait until the next meeting to do that.
Right, okay.
So if there's no further discussion or questions, we can move on to the next item.
I see no further questions, so let's go ahead and move on.
Oh, I skipped over this. This was just the criteria for evaluating comprehensive plan amendments. I'll note that one of them is that there exists an obvious technical error in the information. And so I think that would be the main reason for doing this amendment. Okay, the next item. I've been nicknaming this one Goldbach 1, just as shorthand. But it refers to the comp plan amendment implementation process. And there's currently a small section of code, MICC 1915-230I. And this amendment proposes to repeal that section, and it will remove the direction on how to implement comprehensive plan amendments from our code. And instead, that would be governed by state statute, by the Growth Management Act. And the city agrees with this proposal that the state regulations do provide sufficient guidance on how to implement comprehensive plan amendments and how to adopt consistent development regulations. And I also wanted to note there was a Growth Management Hearings Board case related to this code section. It was appealed by a community member. And the Growth Management Hearings Board found that the adoption of this code was legal, but they cautioned the city that implementation in certain circumstances could result in a GMA violation. So in light of that finding, the city is fine. We see there's no need to keep this code section. Removing it doesn't really have a direct impact on how we would implement comprehensive plan amendments because there is direction from the State Growth Management Act. So we do recommend approving this amendment. And I wanted to note, this is a different recommendation from what you saw when we considered the docket in November. The reason there is mainly when we were talking in November, our analysis was focused on staff capacity and how many items we felt we could docket and how many items we could handle this year in our work plan. And so, we recommended skipping over some of these because we didn't feel that they were a very high priority. They weren't like a must-have, need to do. But now that it is on the docket and we do need to review it and we need to go through the whole process, when we analyze this on its merits, our finding is that it does make sense to approve it. So that's the recommendation. I just wanted to explain that. It's a similar reasoning around the next code amendment.
And Allison, I'm going to ask this question because I know the answer, but this was, if I'm correct, reviewed by the city attorney. And did they have an opinion on this?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, a lot of the wording I just went through was advised by the city attorney, and he feels that it's not necessary to keep this code section. And in light of the Growth Management Hearing Board's caution, it makes sense to remove it.
So we're not making any decisions tonight, but are there, I'll start first with, I guess, questions and or comments from anybody. Does anybody have questions of Allison? Commissioner Goodman?
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I don't have a specific concern about the amendment, but it got me kind of looking at the GMA and the WAC. And I noticed there's a section for implementation of comprehensive plans that indicate you should have some sort of timeline and methodology for implementation in terms of which development regulations will be needed to implement the comprehensive plan. So it's actually kind of new information to me, and I was wondering if you had any insight into how that's done, if that's something we've done in the past or that we'll be doing more in the future.
I am not an expert on this. I'm not the city attorney, but my understanding is that typically you would want to consider both the comprehensive plan amendment and the implementing regulations, the development regulations together, and adopt those in tandem. But I think there may be circumstances where that wouldn't necessarily make sense. I mean, I think this whole case with the Growth Management Hearings Board arose related to the community facilities zone conversation with the Planning Commission and the subsequent adoption of a comp plan amendment a couple of years ago. There may be situations where the city would want to wait to adopt the implementing regulations if we felt there was a need for additional community outreach and input from the public on how the comp plan amendment should be implemented. So the comp plan would set the policy, like we want to create a new zone, and then the regulations would detail the specifics of how that zone would be regulated. And so I think there's thinking that it could make sense to have additional outreach and do that step subsequently, and that could be consistent with the Growth Management Act, because one of the goals of the Growth Management Act is to have public involvement in the process, in the planning process.
I was just kind of trying to square in my head this idea that you have essentially a 20-year plan, but yet, there's this language that you're supposed to somehow identify how you're going to implement it early on. And I don't need a full answer for it now, but more I'm just kind of thinking about it as we move through comp plan amendments in the future.
Yeah. I mean, we have the major amendments that happen on a 9-year cycle, and then we have the annual updates that happen that may, relate to a small section of the comp plan. And so I think, when I'm thinking about the implementation of the comp plan in this piece of code that we're talking about now, I really think about, if you amend the comp plan, then you need to act to make sure that your development regulations and other city policies do implement the guidance that you just adopted in the comprehensive plan. So, there's like a direct link there between updating the comp plan and implementing additional regulations. It's a little different from, if we do, when we look at our 2024 update to the comprehensive plan, that's the big like 20-year look, and how, you know, what kind of housing do we need? What are our climate goals? You know, how do we plan for this growth that's coming? Those kind of questions. And so then I think, you know, your implementation of that may be different. It's not necessarily just one piece of code related to a certain kind of, you know, a certain zone or a certain kind of development. It may be bigger things. It may be we need to adopt a climate action plan, or, you know, we need to revamp our bike and pedestrian planning or something like that.
Okay, thanks. I'll think about it a bit. Thank you.
Mhm.
Are there any other questions or comments on providing any additional color or context? Commissioner Weinberg.
Yeah, if I'm remembering the conversation from November, one of our biggest concerns back then, I think still now, is the workload on staff and making sure that we don't take on more scope than we have bandwidth to get through in the year. And we sent a list to council in November, and the list came back much larger. And so I'm concerned about the bandwidth impacts of this. And I think that was one of the primary reasons that this one was voted down in November, or at least when I was trying to decide my vote on it in November, was that we had other areas where the city was in legal jeopardy, like with the sign code and with the cell towers that needed to take priority for what little bandwidth we had. Has any of that changed? Now that we've had some more time, now staff has more time to look at it, does it look like it's a smaller hit to the overall workload? And is this something that where the bandwidth isn't as much of a blocking issue for this particular issue?
I don't think much has changed. We will be adding that staff position this summer, which will be somewhat helpful, but we have a bandwidth issue. And, you know, by the council adding these items to the final docket, we are now required to review them with the Planning Commission, and we have to do the full process with a public hearing, with a SEPA checklist. So there's a certain amount of work that's just baked into us reviewing this. Whether or not the commission recommends to approve it or deny it, it's roughly the same amount of work for staff. So at this point, now that these items have been docketed, we don't have a lot of choice in the matter. We need to review them, and there's a certain amount of work baked into the process. So I would say my recommendation would be, don't let the staffing capacity affect your recommendation on this at this time.
It sounds like it's kind of water under the bridge at this point. We're
Exactly.
kind of committed to reviewing it, whether we have the capacity or not.
Mhm.
Okay. So essentially at this point, we're not looking at that factor as much as we're looking at the merits of the issue.
Correct.
And I guess with a follow-up question I would have then would be, is there a major downside to the option that is being presented of, instead of having, you know, a two-step process where one passes a land use change and then later passes the development regulations for that, versus having it all at once, where you do the land use change and the development regulations in one block? Is there a downside in terms of giving the public more time and more opportunities to give us feedback on the measure when there's two different checkpoints rather than one?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the city would argue that it would give more time for public feedback if you've got, you know, separate adoptions. I think the counter argument might be that we shouldn't adopt a comp plan amendment if we haven't already thought through what the development regulations would look like and whether or not we actually want to make that change. I mean, I think that's where the community facilities zone conversation got caught up, is that
Right.
when we did start considering the detailed regulations, there was a lot of concerns and it ultimately was not approved. And so, then it made the work of amending the comp plan, wasted.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Goodman?
Thank you. I want to add a little clarification that I don't believe removing this language would preclude the city from adopting a comp plan amendment and then subsequent development regulations. It's more that it just would refer us back to the Washington Administrative Code, which, if I'm reading it correctly, it does allow for that possibility as long as you identify how and when you're going to address the amendment through development regulations. And if I'm incorrect or read it a little wrong, let me know, but that's kind of my take on it.
I believe that's correct. That was my interpretation as well.
Commissioner Boatsman, Jenny, Lucia, do either of you have questions or comments?
No,
The-
I would just say, oh, am I mute or something? Oh, no.
You're
okay.
on.
I would just say that we're governed by the state statute no matter what.
Mhm.
Possibility that having this in our code conflicts with the state regulation under some circumstances. So we might as well remove it.
Okay.
Wait, we still have to follow the state regulation, so we just have to do that.
Okay. Hearing no further questions or comments, Allison, Jenny, did you have?
Well, I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about the distinction that was made in the existing language here, where it's a distinction between amendments that represent an adjustment to an existing policy direction versus those that represent a new policy direction. And I guess my only question is whether we are losing anything by giving up that distinction as delineated here. And it sounds like we're not, and that by making that distinction, we may be leading ourselves to place greater weight on the flexibility to do later development regulations when we're looking at a major change. And my understanding is the reason the language was here in the first place was because when you make a major change, you want to be able to lay out, here's what the vision is, here's why we want to make this change. Let's get everybody to agree that this is the direction we want to go in, and then go into the specifics, because if you, as what happened with the community facilities, you get bogged down on the specifics and then you don't get a chance to actually get agreement on the overall direction. So that's my only question about this is kind of what was the original value of this and what might we be losing by getting rid of this? And if what we're mainly losing is an encouragement to get close to bending the rules, then yeah, let's get rid of it. And I have to say the city attorney's opinion on this carries a great deal of weight with me. If they're saying, yeah, there's no reason not to get rid of it, the state regs are completely sufficient and we're not losing anything by getting rid of this language, then yeah, we should go ahead and get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually have the language here. I'm just going to pull it up. So with this language, it breaks it into the two categories, like you were saying, when things are small changes versus major changes. And I think by removing this, we just need to evaluate each amendment case by case and determine what our process will be and make sure that fits within the state regulations. What this code does is kind of declare our intentions that, when things are minor adjustments, we'll do it this way. When they're major adjustments, we'll do it that way. Without this text in our code, we just need to look case by case and determine what the process is that we want to pursue and make sure it aligns with state requirements.
I think it should be struck for the mere reason of the use of the word practicable, which I'm not sure is a word, but
That's a mushy word.
yeah. Allison, do you have the sort of direction from the group that you need to bring this back for a public hearing?
Yeah, I'm not hearing that we want any modifications to this proposed amendment, and I think we can just move forward with the public hearing at the next meeting.
Okay, great. And that'll take us to the next item.
Yes, so this is what I've been calling Goldbach 2, and it relates to conditional use permits. And it creates a new subsection within 1906 110A5, and it adds clarity on the applicability of conditional use permits. Specifically, it says that they only apply to the property for which the application was made. They don't ever, expand to an adjacent property or something like that. And beyond providing additional clarity, we don't think this amendment would have much further effect. Existing code and procedures in the city already limit conditional use permits to the property boundaries in the application. So we do recommend at this point approving the amendment. Again, back in November, we had recommended not putting this on the docket, and that was mainly in consideration of the time and the importance or the relative impact of this amendment. But now that we are reviewing it and considering it, there's no harm in passing this amendment. It does offer additional clarity. And while it doesn't change how we process things, having additional clarity is always a good thing. The final thing I wanted to say is that we do recommend the commission consider further revising this amendment, because this is something the city attorney brought up when we were discussing it. It uses the term property, which is not defined, and it leaves a bit of ambiguity. Theo asked the question, well, what if the property goes through a lot line adjustment or is combined with an adjacent lot? It's not clear then, is that still the same property, and would the conditional use permit apply to that larger or changed property? And so I think we would recommend just changing some of the verbiage in here to clarify that it's based on the legal description in the application. So I don't have a draft for that today, but I can provide that at the next meeting when we do the final recommendation. And I think it would just be giving a little more clarity about what the word property means that's used throughout this proposed amendment.
Great, we'll go through questions and comments. It looks like Jenny, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I have two comments. One is a really simple one. One of the consistent issues that the members of the community have brought up is the record keeping and availability of information on what conditional use permits apply to existing properties. I don't know if the city code here is the appropriate place to address that, but I do think that's something that we want to address. So that's a simple one. The other thought that I have about this is it useful to make any sort of distinction between built environment alterations versus simple lot line alterations? So for example, the conditional use permit allows the owner to build a building that is not a residential building, and it's an allowed use within a residential zone, and then they purchase a vacant lot next to them, but they haven't done anything with the vacant lot. Does that constitute, I mean, I'm imagining, like, let's say there's a church that has a school, a preschool on their property, and they purchase a vacant lot, and then they want to use that as a playground for the existing use that's already there. So I think the question is there any distinction or usefulness in thinking about the land and the, sort of the lot and the land lines, excuse me, the property lines and the actual land itself versus improvements upon the land? Is there, and help me out here in terms of the technical expertise. I don't know if that makes any difference or if it's a useful separation of concepts.
So real
Yeah.
quick, Lucia, I don't know if it's you. I hear something in the back. It may just be fuzz, but I don't know if you want to mute your Zoom.
Mute it? Okay.
No. Sorry, Lucia. Go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, sorry. Did you not catch what I was saying earlier?
No, we heard you. There was just some background noise, and I wasn't sure where it was coming from. So.
Oh, okay. Are you still hearing background noise?
No, we're good.
It's better now.
Okay, good. Well, let me repeat that a little more succinctly.
I think we heard. I think we heard what you said. I just, before Allison spoke, I wanted to make sure that we removed the distraction.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, conditional use permits often address both the built environment and the uses of the property. Like, they often specify things about landscaping and lighting and parking. If they're related to schools, they sometimes have requirements around where the recreation facilities are. So I'm not sure if that is a useful distinction. I think like the example you gave of a church with a preschool and then they buy another property and they may want to use that as like a playground. I think we would have to evaluate that use on the new property independently. It's not part of the conditional use permit. And so we would need to look at, is having a playground for a commercial business, a daycare, allowed on that property? Or, the church could consider updating their conditional use permit to include the new property as well.
But in theory, if it was a use, because I'm assuming playgrounds are allowed in residentially zoned areas without a conditional use permit. If it were a use that were allowed without a conditional use permit, it wouldn't matter anyway, right?
Right. And so, I don't know if it would be allowed. I mean, this is totally hypothetical, but since it's a commercial business, like the daycare itself is a business and they're operating on this residential property, you have to consider it under those terms.
Or here's another hypothetical that is actually maybe more likely, which is a property that has a conditional use permit and it spans several lots and they want to do a revision of merging the lots. And then does that mean they have to get a new conditional use permit? Or, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think need to be clarified in this.
Yeah.
And as sort of friendly amendments, I mean, I think the spirit of this is certainly, it's clarifying and it's certainly something that we could do. But the question is, how do we actually make it more clear rather than have it add more questions?
Right. We don't want to add ambiguity down the line if there's a question about this.
Commissioner Percy-Baroli, and then we'll go to Commissioner Goodman.
So adding to what Jenny is saying, I can see a scenario where a large holding, let's call it a holding because sometimes there are multiple parcels, has a conditional use permit and they buy an adjacent parcel. I think we need to have in place a process for how they would, incorporate that new parcel. I'm not saying that, it would just be an automatic thing, but, we need to be able to either overlay on top of that, or provide a process for which they can, or do they just apply for a second conditional use permit that would then marry with the first one? Does that make sense? Is that,
I mean, the way I'm reading this language here is that they would need to apply for a new conditional use permit, under the regulations that we already have for conditional use permits. So if they wanted to expand to that new property, they would either have to do a conditional use permit just for that property or a new one for the whole holding.
Clearly not.
Here's a framework that might be useful. So this is in section 5, A is change of ownership, B is change of use, and then the proposed C is applicability. But maybe this could be broken into two things, which would be like a C and a D, and one of them could be change of lot lines or change of parcels, or however you would describe that, essentially to cover this question of of the land designation changing, and then that would just clarify it, and then they sort of, and then maybe have another one which is if the use is changing, or
do we know what Mr. Goldbach's intention was when he applied for this comp plan amendment? Do we know, or this code language amendment or whatever it is? Do we know why he did that? I mean, I suspect I know why. I'm just wondering if there's anything stated about
This
that.
application did not state a reason or a rationale for the amendment.
Commissioner Goodman, you've been waiting. Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I'd say I wouldn't worry about what his intent is. I'd worry more about what the outcome is of whatever we recommend. I was also going to say, in terms of Commissioner Meacham, your kind of suggestions or ideas, my only concern is don't overcomplicate it to the point where you have conflicts with other aspects of the code. So for example, like on any one lot, there are regulations for what can be done. And that's kind of already one section of the code. And by bringing it into the conditional use section, I'm worried that you might kind of create an unintentional conflict, not you specifically, but that there might be something that could happen with that. So, like for example, like if you have multiple lots, but they're all under one conditional use permit, you still have to deal with like the lot line setbacks, all those things. And so I'd be happy to kind of let staff think about it a little bit, but I think we should be careful not to try to create one problem by solving a different potential problem.
Commissioner Weinberg?
A couple of things come to mind. One is a large lot that wants to subplat into smaller lots. If we have a large lot that gets a CUP allowing it to have a building that is, say, taller than the code otherwise allows, but it's okay because there's a row of trees and the area that they're planning to build is behind the row of trees. And if a later owner of the property says they want to cut it up into 5 or 6 different parcels and build houses on it, we want to make sure that the CUP doesn't allow large or tall houses on those sites that would be outside of the normal building code, because we wouldn't want the CUP that was on the large piece to apply to all the pieces that it was broken up into. I think the other thing that that I was writing down was we're having climate change going on, and critical areas are going to start appearing where they weren't when a CUP got defined. And so I'm not sure if we need to factor that in somehow in terms of does the CUP need to be contingent upon the critical areas on the property staying the way they are? or if a large area of the property suddenly becomes wetland, does that invalidate the cup and necessitate the developer to come back and discuss what they can do on that property? So there's two things there. One was the subplatting issue, and the other one was, what do we do when critical areas change?
So if I can offer, I think,
become a wetland. Is this something we need to address in the climate change proposal? Sorry, I just couldn't remember.
yeah. I might offer just Allison's description at the beginning of needing to update the term property used here in the definition, right? Which would be sort of whatever the legal definition of the legal definition of the parcel, or whatever the structure is, however that's defined. And the language to me, which is paramount here, is the for which it was granted, right? So if that legal description changes, it's no longer applicable, right? Whether you cut a piece of property in half or whether you add two together, the description of whatever that legal lot is no longer the legal description that existed when it was granted. So therefore it doesn't, so I think, to Allison's point, being really crisp on how we define property, or however whatever language we use that creates that determination, I think is going to be critical here. And I agree with Commissioner Goodman that, let's not overcomplicate the mix of this. I think if you make that statement, I see hands, that we'll want to make sure to, that I think that second sentence probably needs to be tightened up a little bit, just because I'm not exactly sure how it applies. There's, I think, maybe a verb missing in there somewhere, yeah. Let me go to Commissioner Boatsman and then to Commissioner Purzio-Burley. That was the order I saw.
Before I go ahead, when you have your little yellow hand up there and you change your mind and you don't want to have your hand.
Just click it again and it'll undo it.
Yeah, I've tried that. It doesn't seem to work. Oh, well, now this time it worked. Okay. But anyways, all right. I guess since my hand is still up and I raised my hand, I'll go ahead. While I'm very, I comfortable with any changes people feel need to be made, I feel this thing is not particularly broke. So I think any fixes either might not be needed or could be rather small in order to make this, because, the way I look at it, if a permit's been granted, it is granted to a piece of property. It's just an implication. And so now let me ask, is the language in red is what is being proposed to be added? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you're also talking about adding a definition for the property?
Correct. Yeah. Just a short sentence that says,
Okay. Is there currently a definition of property in the city code?
I will check that. I don't believe there is, but we'll double check.
If there is, or there probably should be, maybe that's the way to a more universal way to deal with the definition of property, is to put it in the actual definition section. But I think there's a lot. This is pretty simple, really. I think it should. I'm fine if people want to change it.
Commissioner Purzio-Burley, you had another comment?
Well, Mr. Goldbach was really heavily involved in debating the JCC, and many things that came up there were the fact that the JCC had historic CUPs. And so my question is, and this might be sort of tangential to what we're talking about, but there didn't seem to be an institutional memory of what those historic permits and CUPs were. and that had been granted to this property. And so I'm wondering if there should be a portion of this code that talks about the way those CUPs will be granted, and then if they are withdrawn, then they're, you know, then they're kind of crossed out, but they're not eliminated, so that they still remain kind of a part of the institutional memory. So we sort of understand kind of the history of a property, because oftentimes when you make these decisions, you sort of want to understand where the parcels, where the properties come from, especially if it's been in continuous ownership by the applicant. So some of these properties, these churches and religious institutions on the island have been in continuous ownership for 60, 70 years. I mean, like a long time. And, you know, a lot of this stuff gets lost in the mix. And if we have that historic document, then it's easier to kind of trace where it's been and where it's going. Does that make, am I kind of like really speaking out of school, or does that seem like a valuable idea, concept?
It's true that it's been an issue in terms of, especially code compliance, when there's a complaint about something on a property that, you know, people say, well, this was agreed to in the CUP back in, you know, 1975. And a property may have had a series of new CUPs or updated CUPs over the years. They may have had, you know, 3 or 4 versions. And it's unclear, you know, do the conditions that were put in place on the CUP back in 1975 still apply now, even though new CUPs have been adopted for that property? And it's true, there is not a good way to track those requirements over time. And it's unclear, you know, does the new CUP wipe them away, or do they carry forward?
Yeah, so that's something that I would like to see part of this, you know, part of this, because I think that we could have avoided a lot of the heartache and just basic overall contention about this if we knew what the historic record was and what the requirements had been applied to the JCC in the first place. And then we could have kind of understood what the rancor was, but we didn't have that.
Commissioner Boatsman, I know you had your hand up.
Do CUPs expire?
No.
Wow. That's kind of odd, because there's so many things we're concerned about nowadays that we weren't concerned about 30 years ago.
Well, if they change their use or, you know, want to do something beyond what was allowed in the CUP, then they would need to modify it as required in this code here.
Commissioner Goodman?
Thank you. You know, maybe to shed a little light on that, Commissioner Boatsman, is just, you know, if you think of any property, once it's built, you're not required to change it if circumstances change in the future. So that's, I guess, one way you could think about it. That said, I understand that sometimes uses maybe seem different than sort of the actual built environment. Was just kind of thought at the top of my head. I wanted to say, I thought, Lucia, your comment made a lot of sense. I don't know if it makes sense to put that in code or if it's more an in-house administrative thing, but certainly the idea of there should be some process to essentially replace a CUP when a new one is granted. Like maybe the applicable conditions do move over, and, you know, ones that don't apply anymore are dropped, however that may be. There should be a process for that if it doesn't exist. And then the last thing I wanted to say is I heard Commissioner Weinberg, I think earlier, at a concern that wasn't addressed in terms of what if you have a property that, say, has a certain height limit for one building, and then in the future they build something different. The only thing I was going to say to that is my understanding with our current CUP process is you can't grant someone a CUP with development regulations that don't conform to the zone they're in. So for example, if the height of the zone was 30 feet and someone had a CUP on that property, their height limit would still be 30 feet. They don't get, 35 feet just because they have a CUP. The CUP actually adds usually additional conditions to either the development or the use. That's regulated. We don't have, a process in-house where you kind of trade things off and on. That's why we had, had so many discussions a year or two ago about how to deal with these sort of situations.
Yeah.
That's it.
And if they were changing from a church or a school or whatever to residential, that would be a change of use, and the code requires them to amend their CUP.
I
Commissioner
still
Boatman.
think that sorry, Dan, I still think that figuring out a way to have a historic memory or register of what's been applied to a property, and this, when we get into the residential development standards, I'm going to address that also, but this is a really critical issue when people want, when people are concerned about what's going to be developed on an adjacent property to theirs.
Commissioner
Sorry.
Boatson.
Yeah, just briefly, I don't understand CUPs very well, I have very little experience with it, but I guess what I'm just asking is if somebody has a CUP that's 30 years old, but the critical areas regulations change and they want to come and actually get a permit and build something in 2021, are they subject to the current code in that respect?
Say that again. So they had a CUP and they want to come in and redevelop on the property?
Well, let's say the CUP is 30 years old, but they never actually built it. They never actually did what they got permission to do. But now in 2021, they want to do what they had permission to do. But now there's quite different regulations in critical areas and all sorts of things have changed. Do they have to meet the new regs? Because if we compare this to like a building permit, those permits expire after you get a permit and you don't do anything with it. I think it goes kaput in a couple of years. About that.
That's a good question, and I think it's pretty complicated. It would definitely need some legal advice. I think aspects of the CUP may hold, but they would definitely still need to come in for a building permit, and they would have a lot of rights that are not vested.
Okay, I
I don't know how that would relate to critical areas and those things specifically, but they still would have to go through the building permit process.
Okay, I kind of get it now. I'm just sort of ignorant about CUPs.
Commissioner Goodman and then Jenny.
I think I don't have anything more to say.
Jenny.
Oh, I was just going to say anecdotes are not data, but Commissioner Boatman, what you are suggesting happened. I lived in an apartment building in DC that had been originally planned to have 3 wings, but this was built in 1925 or something. So when the crash happened, and they didn't build the 3rd wing. So then in 2001, they said, hey, we want to build that 3rd wing, and we still have the permit from back in 1925. And it was legal, and that permit don't expire. So
Wow.
They were able to go and build a whole new wing. And of course, they had to do it to modern construction standards.
Yeah.
But they didn't have to go through any of the public, I don't know if they had to do an environmental impact statement. They probably didn't, because they already had the permit.
They had permission.
They had already built the foundation. I think that was the thing, that they already
Oh.
had the foundation. So
Yeah.
they were able to build the building on top of the existing foundation.
Very interesting.
So, these things do happen.
Yeah.
I don't know that we have anything like that here on Mercer Island, but it's not an unknown phenomenon.
Yeah.
If there's anything I have confidence in, is that if there's a loophole like that to be found, someone on the island will want to find it.
Yep.
So with all of that, I tended to just sort of bringing us to back around to this. I generally heard consensus, Allison, that the direction for this was correct. If there was anything different that you heard? Maybe if you could just articulate.
I heard a couple things, and I'm not sure if we had a majority of the commission behind each of these, so let's just check in on that. So the first one was perhaps instead of calling this section C applicability, the title or the italics part there should be changed to say something like change of lot lines or change of legal description. I think that could tie in with however we address the definition of property, potentially.
Possibly you have, just to be consistent, one of two things. One, applicability is used a lot of places, but you say change of ownership, change of use, and then maybe you could just say change of boundary or something like that.
Yeah. So if everyone's okay with that concept, I can work on drafting something with the city attorney when we address the definition.
Or something like change of legal definition of the property or legal delineation, whatever.
I'm going to defer to my normal mantra, which is let's stop reinventing the wheel and see what other jurisdictions have done about this, because this is not original thinking by any stretch of the imagination. We need to understand what the definition of a property is. It's out there. So I think it'd be easier to do research and dig up what already exists than it is to try to reinvent the wheel with something that might be erroneous.
We definitely don't need to wordsmith it right now. I can work through this with the city attorney and have a final draft prepared for next month.
Okay.
Dan?
Yep. Yes.
The one thing I had added, which I didn't hear recapped by Allison, was the idea that there probably shouldn't be a unique definition for the word property in this section of the code, because we do have that problem sometimes in our code where there are in context definitions, but then there may or may not be a definition in the code, the definitions for Title 19, and you start getting conflicts with terms. So I would prefer that if there's going to be a definition of property, that it be explored whether that could be actually in the definition section.
Yeah, I think they'll figure out sort of the legal construct of where that needs to go, based on Commissioner Pertio-Burley's suggestion of like actually just recycling a definition somewhere else.
I just want to run by the city attorney whether he feels that this definition needs to be specific to conditional use permits in this code section, or if it is more of a global thing that fits with how we define property throughout the code.
Okay.
The only other thing I heard was this idea about what happens when a CUP is amended or replaced with a new CUP, and how do we track the requirements. I'm not sure I heard anyone saying we should amend the code related to this, but it did sound like there was a few people that mentioned it. So I wanted to check in, are we asking for a section of code on that, or is that something that we should just take as feedback on our procedure on how we do things internally within CPD?
That for me, that's however you want to handle it, but we really need to figure out a way to be able to track what, what has been allowed on a property, what's been required on a property, so that when somebody comes to us and says, well, in 1968, we were told that when this CUP was approved, there'd be no parking lot here. And here they are, they've built a parking lot and they've cut down trees and they're not following the rules. So, and when we get to residential standards, I've got another example that has to do with the way yards are determined. So I want to see if there's a way that the city can make sure that requirements that have been layered on a property are maintained in the city's memory, so that, because sometimes the property will change hands, or membership dies off and new membership comes in and nobody knows what the requirements are. So somebody needs to be the keeper of that information.
Commissioner Goodwin.
Yeah, I have to ask now, does this process not exist for records, of more recent time? I can understand 50 years ago, but don't we have some process to look up permits on properties, in the somewhat recent past?
We do have records, and actually, as with the JCC, we were able to unearth a lot of those records. Eventually, it took a lot of research into our, document archive to find everything, but there was a code compliance case related to some of the things that were going on in the property. We had to research through the history, like 50 years of CUP documents and planning commission meetings and all kinds of things to try to figure out, what was agreed to as a part of those approvals back in the 70s and 80s.
Can I suggest something? It might be as simple as saying, okay, CUP is recorded with the property so that when you have a question, you go to King County Records and you just pull it up because it's been recorded. I realize that everything's gone digital now, but even now, like when I go online to figure out what permits have been let, it's difficult to kind of get down to the nitty gritty on what the conditions of a permit are.
So I want to recognize you, Ted, but I just wanted to note or ask the question, Allison, like, I agree with at least the premise of what Lucia's laying out. I'm not sure this is the place or the avenue to address those concerns. So
I mean, I agree with the concept as well. And I think, we do have the records, but they're not in a way that's easy to access or for staff to, be aware of the requirements on a kind of operational day-to-day basis. So figuring out some way to do this makes a lot of sense to me. If everyone agrees it should not be a code requirement, then, that's something I can take back for us to discuss with staff and try to figure out more of a procedural fix for it.
Yeah. Ted?
Just wondering, is it possible to say that all CUPs on a property need to be cumulative of all prior CUPs on the property so that you don't end up with multiple CUPs? You have only one. And anytime that they want to amend it later on, they can amend it, but you don't end up with multiple CUPs. You have just one that keeps getting changed, but every time it gets changed, the record gets refreshed with the same text that the year before.
I mean, that was I was going to suggest, if people are interested in a code amendment, is that a new CUP would fully replace the old ones and any old requirements were wiped away. And if people were wanting to bring those forward, they would need to be written into the new CUP as a requirement.
Yeah. I've got a thumbs up from Tiffin, and Jenny, you have a comment or a question?
Just a comment. I think that doing it that way, in effect, erases the history that we're talking about. Because what people want to know is what was agreed to way back when, as opposed to what's the latest agreement. I would propose that we simply defer this to the staff, to Allison's understanding of kind of how to put this in place in some sort of a policy mechanism. I don't think this belongs in the code, probably not. So I think that we're trying to be helpful, but we're ending up micromanaging something that really Allison and the staff are perfectly capable of figuring out.
Okay. Allison, did you have any other things that you wanted clarity on, just that you've heard, to make sure that you have what you need to come back?
Well, that covered the things I had jotted down as possibilities, and I think we've got clarity that, I'm going to work with the city attorney to figure out the best way to deal with the definition, whether it's here or in the definition section, and we may edit the applicability word to be more in line with that in terms of a change of boundaries or a change of property description or something like that.
Okay. And I'll just add in there that if for some reason you feel that in your exploration of this, that to the points that have been raised around the I'll call it the stacking of these things. If you upon further thought say to yourself, oh no, there's an exactly perfect way to manage this, or maybe in your research of other stuff you see other cities that have implemented something, I would say bring that forward. Otherwise, I would say we should proceed with the idea that there's probably some procedural mechanism that should be reviewed and suggested upon to solve that problem.
Mhm. Okay, sounds good.
Great. All right, with that, I think unless there's someone vociferously needs to make any other points to that, we will close the conversation around I think you were calling it, Allison, the Goldbach 2 amendment related to the CUP applicability. And I believe we are done with all of the items on regular business.
That's right. And
And that would bring us to other business. Do you have a deputy director's report, Allison?
I really don't. I covered my updates in the beginning of my presentation because I felt it would just sort of set the context for the rest of the discussion. Just a final reminder that we'll be coming back February 17th with a public hearing on the three public hearings on the items we just discussed. And we're also planning to bring the wireless code back for a work session. So that packet will come out to you, a few days in advance of the meeting, and would really encourage you to take a look at the materials we provide around the wireless code and kind of do your homework ahead of the meeting so that we can have an in-depth discussion and get all your feedback during that work session.
Great. And you likely don't have additional details because I know it happened at the council meeting last night. My understanding was that there was some sort of action taken related to an information session that may be required related to the city's ethics code sometime before April. So I know that's not on our work plan, and it hasn't been added to things. Allison, probably, you probably don't want to talk to it since I don't know how much detail is out there, but I just thought I would mention that that's likely going to also be in our queue of things in one of the next two meetings.
Yeah, thanks. I actually don't know much more about this. I was on the meeting last night as well and heard that discussion, and I understand there's going to be a training for all the commissions on ethics. I don't know any more about that or when the timing will be. I'll definitely be coordinating with our city manager's office to get that scheduled, and I'll let you know when I know more.
Yep. Very good. I saw someone had a hand. Was that you, Tiffin?
I had mine up for a while. Ted,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The wireless issue has a tendency to be rather large. There's a lot of material to consider. And I was wondering if, in order to facilitate this, getting this done in one meeting, would it be possible, Allison, to send out the summary of how far we took it before? Sometime before the packet, so that we could be thinking about some of those things before the packet hits. Just trying to see if we can make things move a little more quickly, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was not at those meetings, so I'm a little bit at a disadvantage to summarize things, but I'm happy to pull together, here's the presentation materials and the minutes from that meeting, and send that out to you guys to take a look at.
The minutes, I'm a little concerned that the minutes wouldn't really capture things like, for example, we looked at certain impacts such as appearance or sound or things like that. And we actually we took sort of some straw polls as to what we would prioritize. This was something we were quite concerned about. These things are at the bottom of our concerns. I mean, I would imagine in somebody's notes, those conversations could be captured.
I can check in with our planners, Robin and Andrew, who I think were probably involved last
Thank
year.
you very much. That would be great. We had a good discussion at the time.
Okay. Tiffin?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, Carolyn, I think you even have something you have, and maybe it would even make sense to email those directly to Allison so she kind of knows what to provide you information on, if that's the case. If it's not the case, that's fine. And then I think Robin was the planner on that, if I remember correctly. So
You're right.
she has notes on it. But yeah, I remember we looked at a lot of pictures and did some like visual preference surveys, and we actually spent a lot of time talking more about like outreach and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I would feel I was sort of flying blind to try to just pick some things out of my head right now that, oh gee, I think I was thinking about this or that. I'd rather see it in the context of the discussion we had and go from there. I think it'll be much more useful to everybody, including me for sure.
One quick question about next meeting. Will we be doing the public hearing first and then going into the wireless?
We could do it either way, but that probably makes sense to help people from the public who want to make comments to be able to do that in a more timely manner.
I thought it makes sense to do the formality first, and then we can have more of an open discussion about the wireless if there's no reason we can't do it that way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it'll just be easier for folks that are trying to call in and make their comments to just do that at the front of the meeting and not have to hang out for however long we end up talking. So. You're muted, Commissioner Hubble.
I see that now. Commissioner Weinberg, you have your hand up.
Sorry, it's an old hand. Let me figure out how to take it down.
Just slap your hand. That's what.
Now mine. Okay.
Yeah, I got it down. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. Okay. Anything else, Allison, from you for your report?
Nope, I'm done.
Okay. So our next meeting on the 17th, I think we started this way in the beginning. It is midwinter break. Is there anybody who's expecting to be absent that week at this point in time? I may go skiing earlier in the day, but I will be back in time to call into our
Anybody
meeting.
know how the snow's gonna be?
It's been phenomenal. It's been phenomenal so far. I can tell
Well,
you
I
that.
was supposed to go tomorrow, but we decided not to because it's like totally icy up there.
Well, it's gotten bad the last couple days, but it was fantastic over the weekend.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so our next meeting will be February the 17th. And is there any other business for the good of the order from anyone here? Hearing none. Happy New Year. Happy January, and we will see
Happy
you guys.
Inauguration Day.
Happy Inauguration Day. And thank you very much. I think I'm officially supposed to say the time is 8:03 and the meeting is officially adjourned. Wait, there's a reminder. It got cut off. So is there a reminder, Andrea, that I'm supposed to mention?
Just to stay seated and not leave. I will end the meeting for all.
Ah, perfect. Great. Everyone, thank you very much. And we'll see you in a month.
Good night. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.